The deepest wounds often come from those we first loved. When a mother's touch, meant to nurture and protect, becomes the source of our earliest pain, something profound shifts in the spiritual architecture of a child. These maternal wounds aren't merely emotional injuries that time can easily heal. They become embedded in our spiritual DNA, shaping how we experience connection, trust, and even our own worthiness of love. Cayce once observed that the mother-child bond represents our first experience of God's love on earth. When this bond is fractured through neglect, criticism, emotional manipulation, or outright abuse, it doesn't just damage our relationship with our mother, it distorts our relationship with existence itself. The spiritual scar tissue forms around questions no child should have to ask. If my own creator cannot love me properly, am I fundamentally unlovable? For sons especially, maternal wounds carry a unique spiritual burden. While society readily acknowledges the father-son dynamic as formative to masculine identity, the wounds from a mother often remain unexplored territory, a hidden battlefield where no witnesses acknowledge the war. The son learns early that his pain in relation to his mother must remain invisible, creating the first layers of his spiritual armor. This invisible armor becomes both protection and prison. It shields the vulnerable parts that were once rejected or unseen by the maternal gaze, but it also creates a spiritual fortress that prevents authentic connection. The son develops a reflexive spiritual vigilance, scanning relationships for signs of the same rejection, abandonment, or conditional love he experienced with his mother. What makes maternal wounds particularly devastating to spiritual development is their primal nature. Before we had language, before we understood the concept of relationship, the mother represented our entire world. Her emotional states became the atmosphere we breathed. Her responses to our needs formed our first understanding of whether the universe was fundamentally safe or dangerous, abundant or scarce, loving or indifferent. When a mother's love comes with conditions, being quiet enough, achieving enough, suppressing enough of our authentic selves, we learn that love itself is conditional. This creates a spiritual wound where we become strangers to our own souls, abandoning parts of ourselves deemed unlovable by the maternal mirror. The authentic self goes into hiding, and a performance of worthiness takes its place. The maternal wound's spiritual impact extends beyond childhood, coloring adult relationships with both divine and human love. Many sons find themselves unconsciously recreating the emotional patterns established with their mothers, seeking validation from partners who cannot provide it, maintaining emotional distance as protection, or becoming caretakers who anticipate others' needs while neglecting their own spiritual hunger. This hidden war continues silently within, creating a spiritual dissonance between the longing for unconditional love and the deep-seated belief that such love is either dangerous or unattainable. The son's spiritual journey becomes complicated by this wound, sometimes driving him towards spiritual practices as a means of finding the unconditional acceptance missing from his earliest relationship. Other times creating a profound skepticism about love's reliability in any form. The first step toward healing these spiritual scars is simply acknowledging the war being waged within. This recognition isn't about blaming the mother, who often carried her own unhealed maternal wounds, but about honoring the depth of the pain and its spiritual consequences. When we bring compassionate awareness to these wounds, we begin the sacred work of reclaiming our spiritual birthright to give and receive love without the distortions of early conditioning. The spiritual impact of maternal wounds extends far beyond emotional pain. It restructures the very way a son perceives his place in the cosmos. When a mother's love is inconsistent, conditional, or entirely absent, it creates what spiritual teachers describe as soul fragmentation. Parts of the authentic self become separated and hidden, creating a spiritual diaspora within one's own being. The son doesn't merely feel abandoned by his mother, he experiences an abandonment from himself. This fragmentation manifests as a profound spiritual homesickness, a persistent feeling of not belonging anywhere, even in spaces where one is ostensibly welcome. Many sons with maternal wounds describe moving through life with an inexplicable sense of alienation, as if they're perpetual visitors to a world where everyone else received the manual for belonging. This spiritual dislocation stems from the primal experience of not being fully seen, held, and celebrated in their mother's gaze. The spiritual landscape of the maternally wounded son often features what contemplative traditions call the divided heart. One part yearns desperately for connection and authentic love, while another part remains vigilant, expecting disappointment and preparing defenses against it. This division creates a spiritual exhaustion, as maintaining these opposing forces demands enormous energy that might otherwise fuel creative expression, relational intimacy, or spiritual growth. Sons carrying maternal wounds frequently develop what spiritual director Thomas Merton termed the false self, a carefully constructed identity designed to win approval and avoid abandonment. This false self becomes increasingly sophisticated over time, often achieving external success, while the authentic self remains malnourished and undeveloped. The spiritual tragedy lies in how many sons mistake this false self for their true identity, never recognizing the spiritual suffocation occurring beneath the surface of achievement and adaptation. The wounded son's spiritual relationship with trust becomes particularly complex. Having experienced the unpredictability or absence of maternal attunement, he develops a spiritual hypervigilance that makes surrender, a cornerstone of most spiritual traditions, feel dangerous rather than liberating. This creates a paradoxical spiritual journey. The son may deeply hunger for transcendent connection, while simultaneously maintaining rigid control that prevents such experiences. The maternal wound also distorts the son's relationship with the feminine aspects of spirituality. Whether in religious contexts that honor divine feminine principles, or in secular spiritual approaches that value receptivity and intuition, the son may approach these qualities with unconscious wariness. His spiritual life becomes unbalanced as he over-identifies with qualities traditionally coded as masculine: reason, structure, will, while remaining disconnected from the feminine spiritual attributes of receptivity, nurturing presence, and emotional fluidity. Perhaps most profoundly, maternal wounds create what mystical traditions call the veiled heart. This spiritual condition describes the soul's protective covering that prevents it from fully experiencing love's presence. The son may intellectually understand spiritual teachings about love's omnipresence, but find himself unable to feel this truth. The veil, woven from early experiences of maternal inconsistency or rejection, creates a spiritual numbness that persists despite sincere spiritual seeking. The spiritual consequences extend to the son's relationship with his own body, the temple of spirit in many traditions. Maternal wounds often create a disconnection from embodied experience, as the body holds memories of early needs that went unmet. This disembodiment represents a spiritual schism, separating the son from the wisdom and guidance available through his physical presence. Healing requires a reconnection to bodily sensations and emotions as trustworthy spiritual messengers rather than threats to be managed. In relationships, the spiritual scar tissue from maternal wounds creates patterns that spiritual teachers recognize as karmic repetition, unconsciously recreating familiar dynamics of pursuing unavailable love, doubting genuine affection when offered, or maintaining emotional distance as protection. These patterns persist not from conscious choice, but from the soul's unresolved longing to heal the original maternal relationship. Until recognized and compassionately addressed, these spiritual patterns continue their painful cycle across relationships. The hidden war within the maternally wounded son thus becomes a spiritual crisis of authenticity, embodiment, and belonging. The spiritual journey forward requires not just psychological understanding, but a soul-level reclamation of the abandoned parts, bringing them from exile back into the wholeness that is every being's spiritual birthright. The journey from maternal wounding towards spiritual wholeness represents one of life's most profound alchemical processes. Like the ancient practice of transmuting base metals into gold, this inner work transforms the lead of childhood pain into the gold of spiritual wisdom. However, this transformation requires far more than intellectual understanding or conventional therapy. It demands a courageous descent into what mystics have called the dark night of the soul. This descent begins when a son finally acknowledges the full extent of his maternal wound. The spiritual practice of radical honesty becomes essential here, naming not just the obvious traumas, but also the subtle abandonments, the conditional love, the emotional manipulations that may have been disguised as care. This naming process isn't about assigning blame, but about reclaiming spiritual sovereignty over one's own experience. As spiritual teacher Ram Dass noted, "You cannot heal what you cannot feel." The maternally wounded son must then engage in the spiritual discipline of grief work. Unprocessed grief becomes spiritually toxic, creating blockages in the energetic body that manifest as chronic anger, depression, addiction, or relationship sabotage. The grief that must be honored includes mourning not just what happened, but what didn't happen, the mothering that was needed but never received. This grief work isn't a single event, but a spiritual practice that unfolds in layers, each revealing deeper aspects of the original wound. A critical spiritual turning point occurs when the son recognizes what contemplative traditions call the wound as threshold. This perspective shift allows him to see that his maternal wound, while painful, has also served as an initiation into deeper spiritual awareness. Many spiritually awakened individuals report that their earliest wounds became the very doorways through which their most profound insights eventually emerged. The wound becomes not just something to heal from, but something to learn through. The spiritual practice of forgiveness becomes central to this alchemical process, though often misunderstood. True forgiveness isn't about excusing harmful behavior or pretending the wound doesn't matter. Rather, it's about releasing the spiritual burden of resentment that keeps the son energetically tethered to the very dynamics he seeks to transcend. As Cayce taught, forgiveness is not for the other person. It's the key that unlocks your own prison. This forgiveness extends not just to the mother, but critically to oneself. Many sons carry unconscious self-blame for their maternal wounds, harboring the spiritually toxic belief that had they somehow been different, better, quieter, more accomplished, less needy, they would have received the love they craved. This self-forgiveness represents a profound spiritual homecoming, an acknowledgement that the child was always worthy of love exactly as he was. The alchemical process continues through what spiritual traditions call reparenting the soul. The wounded son learns to provide himself with the spiritual nurturing his mother couldn't offer, developing an internal maternal presence characterized by unconditional acceptance, appropriate boundaries, and attuned responsiveness to his authentic needs. This isn't merely a psychological exercise, but a spiritual practice of embodying divine love for one's own being. As this internal transformation progresses, the son often experiences what mystical traditions describe as the expansion of compassion. His own wound becomes a gateway to recognizing the universal nature of suffering and the intergenerational patterns of maternal wounding. He begins to see his mother not just as the source of his pain, but as someone caught in her own unhealed patterns. This expanded perspective doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but places it within a larger spiritual context of human wounding and potential healing. The spiritual alchemy reaches its most transformative stage when the son discovers that his wound has prepared him for unique service to others. Many spiritual teachers, healers, and wisdom keepers trace their calling directly to their earliest wounds. The sensitivity, insight, and empathy developed through navigating their own suffering becomes the foundation for their spiritual gifts to the world. What began as abandonment becomes, paradoxically, the source of their most meaningful contributions. Throughout this alchemical journey, the son gradually releases what Buddhist tradition calls the story of self, the narrative of victimhood or deficiency constructed around the maternal wound. As this story loosens its grip, a more expansive spiritual identity emerges, one not defined by early wounding, but informed by the wisdom gained through its transformation. The hidden war gives way to an embodied peace that honors both the wound's reality and the soul's inherent wholeness beyond all conditions. The culmination of healing maternal wounds lies not in their erasure, but in their sacred integration. What began as spiritual scarring ultimately becomes the very texture of one's unique wisdom. This final stage of the journey involves what depth psychologists call shadow integration, bringing the disowned aspects of our experience into conscious relationship with our whole being. For sons with maternal wounds, this means neither rejecting nor being defined by these early experiences, but allowing them to be transmuted into spiritual maturity. The integration process begins with a profound spiritual recognition. The mother who wounded was herself a wounded child. This perspective isn't meant to excuse harmful behavior, but to place it within the larger spiritual context of intergenerational patterns. Many spiritual traditions teach that unhealed trauma passes through bloodlines until someone is willing to feel its full impact and interrupt its transmission. The son who undertakes this healing work becomes what some traditions call an ancestor in training, one who bears the discomfort of conscious healing to liberate future generations. As integration deepens, many sons experience what contemplative traditions describe as the blessing in the wound. They discover that their maternal wounding, while painful, cultivated specific spiritual strengths that would not have developed otherwise. The heightened sensitivity that once felt like a liability becomes an asset in detecting subtle energies and unspoken truths. The self-reliance born of necessity transforms into spiritual sovereignty. The careful observation of others' emotional states that began as survival becomes profound empathic wisdom. This integration requires embracing what spiritual teacher Parker Palmer calls the paradox of wholeness, holding seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. The son learns to acknowledge both that his mother's limitations cause genuine harm and that these very limitations may have catalyzed his most significant spiritual growth. He recognizes that he can simultaneously honor the child who deserved better and the adult who has been strengthened through adversity. This paradoxical thinking represents spiritual maturity beyond binary judgments. The integration process often leads to what mystics describe as wounded healer consciousness. The son realizes that his deepest wounds and greatest gifts spring from the same source, that his capacity to accompany others through darkness comes precisely from having navigated his own. As this consciousness matures, the son may find himself naturally drawn to mentoring younger men, creating containers for authentic emotional expression, or modeling healthy masculine vulnerability that includes rather than rejects the traditionally feminine qualities of nurturing and receptivity. A powerful marker of integration appears in the son's relationship with divine presence. Where maternal wounding often creates spiritual distrust or excessive self-reliance, integration allows for what theologian Martin Buber called the I-thou relationship, an authentic spiritual connection that neither demands perfection nor fears abandonment. The son discovers that the divine mother energy he sought externally has always resided within, accessible through contemplative practices that bypass the wounded ego's defenses. As integration continues, many sons experience what spiritual traditions call the alchemy of compassion. Their relationship with their actual mother, whether she is living or deceased, whether reconciliation has been possible or not, transforms through their expanded spiritual understanding. Some discover the capacity for what Buddhism terms fierce compassion, maintaining clear boundaries while holding genuine care for their mother's own wounded journey. Others find that their inner healing creates unexpected shifts in the external relationship, sometimes facilitating healing conversations that were previously impossible. Perhaps the most profound aspect of integration is what contemplative traditions call the return to original nature. The son recognizes that beneath the layers of wounding, adaptive behaviors, and false identities lies an unconditioned self that was never actually damaged. This discovery creates a spiritual homecoming to what was always present, but obscured by pain and protection. From this grounded awareness, the son can engage with his maternal wound not as a defining story, but as one chapter in his soul's larger journey. The integrated son eventually embodies what spiritual teacher Richard Rohr describes as the second simplicity, a return to childlike presence that includes rather than denies life's complexity. He no longer needs elaborate defenses against vulnerability nor intellectual frameworks to explain his worth. The war within gives way to a peace that doesn't require perfect resolution of all questions, but rests in the mystery of being simultaneously wounded and whole, shaped by history, yet free in the present moment. This integration ultimately reveals the deepest spiritual truth about maternal wounds. They were never merely personal injuries, but invitations to participate in humanity's collective healing. Each son who transforms his maternal wound contributes to the restoration of sacred balance between masculine and feminine energies, that extends far beyond individual relationships. What began as one child's hidden war becomes, through conscious integration, a quiet revolution in how we understand love, belonging, and our shared spiritual inheritance. If these words have touched something deep within you, know that you're not alone in this sacred work of healing. Subscribe now to receive the remaining chapters of this spiritual exploration and join our community of seekers transforming maternal wounds into wisdom. Share your own insights in the comments below. Your voice matters in this collective healing journey. Remember, the war may be hidden, but the path to peace is walked together. Subscribe, comment, and become part of something larger than your individual pain. The transformation you seek may be just one connection away.